All right, welcome everybody. Glad you're here with us. This is Mike Davis. We're a little bit late. We were praying and rejoicing and talking about the scriptures in our online Zoom group, the Oasis, our fellowship. So I'm glad you're here with us, joining us for our online portion on Facebook, where we study the Word of God together. So let's jump into this. Last week, we were in part 10 of our series. Yes, 10 parts we have now of Who's the Boss, Women and Men in Biblical and Cultural Context. We did part 10 last week where we looked at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16. We're going to revisit that again today and next week. As I was putting this message together, I realized it's going to take 2 parts to do this. There's actually 3 parts by the time we get to next week's. But last week in Genesis 3:16, we looked at the passage. So turn over to Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. We'll read that. And Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. And we're going in depth. And one of the things that we are doing, especially today, is going more so into the culture of ancient Israel, seeking to understand, as we've done in other sessions, but especially on this verse, chapter 3, verse 16. I have some cool stuff I'm going to be sharing with you today. But looking at this passage in its linguistic and its cultural context, so that we can better understand what's being said about women, how are we to understand and tackle this passage. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, it says, God, this is after what we refer to today as the fall. Adam and Eve partook of the fruit in the garden that they were not supposed to partake of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Their eyes were open, they hid from God, God called them out. And in verse 16, God talks to the woman and he says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, as we've said, there are various ways that people have interpreted this text. Last week, we looked at the complementarian view, at least one of the primary complementarian views of this passage, where it is often taught that what this is referring to is, and what it's teaching is that the woman, Eve, that she, because of the fall, she ended up with either because of the fall or because of God's judgment, she ended up with an innate sinful desire or inclination, a desire to where she would be motivated from that point on, she would be motivated to resist male leadership, and she would seek to dominate her husband, or for women in general, they would seek to dominate their husband or to dominate other men, okay? This is how this passage has been interpreted. Often is one of the primary interpretations, not the only one, but one of the primary interpretations within the complementarian worldview about men and women. We looked at this last week and I said, no, this is not how we should be interpreting this text. We looked at the problems with interpreting the text this way. But there's also some other interpretations of this text, both within egalitarian and complementarian views. In the history of interpretations, there's been a lot of them. And so we're going to look at some of the different interpretations real quick in terms of the history of how this verse has been interpreted, and what it means when it says, your desire shall be for your husband and he shall rule over you. So there's about, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's at least 5, depending on how you count it, 5 or 6 different interpretations. We're going to look at 5, one of which we've already looked at, and that is the rebellious desire. I'm going to call these certain names. One is called the rebellious desire, and I'm getting that from the book How God Sees Women that you see back there, How God Sees Women by Taryn Williams. Some of these names he came up with, and I'm just borrowing them. This is so Taryn Williams from his book How God Sees Women. So one of the desires he talks about is the rebellious desire. This is the one we talked about last week, and this is the one that says women, because of the fall and or because of the judgment of God, or because of the curse that was laid upon them, depending on how you look at it, that there was given to women, or women possess an innate sinful desire that causes them to resist male headship or the headship of their husband. Sometimes they're not the same. And it will also, not only do they resist it, but they seek to control and dominate their husbands, or they seek to control and dominate other men. This is the rebellious desire interpretation. We dealt with that last week. Go back and look at message number 10. All right. The second one that I'm going to look at is what they call the servile, or I'm also going to call the slavish or slavish desire. And this one was put forth by John Calvin. the reformer, the famous John Calvin. Richard M. Davison, in the book that we've been quoting from a lot, The Flame of Yahweh, he talks about how John Calvin saw this verse, John chapter 3, verse 16. So this is what he says in the book. Let me read to you. This is from page 60 and note 20. He quotes John Calvin. He says, John Calvin sees women's position before the fall, now, so before they partook of the fruit, John Calvin saw the woman's position as liberal and gentle subjection. So he saw the woman as being liberal and generous in their subjection. After the fall, John Calvin says, quote, she is cast into servitude. Nonetheless, she still desires what her husband desires. So he understood that after the fall, Eve goes into servitude, but she still desires what her husband desires. There's another scholar by the name of John Skinner, and by the way, that was from Calvin's commentary on Genesis, volume 1 of 10 volumes. This is where he says this. Another scholar by the name of John Skinner, he, in a critical and exegetical commentary on Genesis, he says this, that John 3:16, when it says that your desire shall be for your, not John 3:16, Genesis 3:16, I didn't think that sounded right. Genesis 3:16, he says, he speaks of the woman's desire as, quote, desire which makes her the willing slave of the man. So that's another interpretation, is that they saw this as saying, well, what's going to happen after the fall is that a woman, she's in subjection to the man, but now she has this, she's like, she has this slavish or slavish, I'm not sure which way you pronounce that, but she's like a slave. She just wants to serve the man. She just wants to give herself to the man. She's like a slave to him because of this desire. I'll do anything you want me to do. What your desire is my desire. That was one interpretation of this passage. So rebellious desire, a servile, slavish desire. A third one is that when it says your desire should be for your husband and he shall rule over you, some complementarians see this as a reaffirmation of man's leadership that was established at creation. So as I shared with you before, complementarians see this passage as when it says your desire should be for your husband, they see this as this is when women come under subjection to man's rule. This is the birth of patriarchy. Most egalitarians do not believe that Genesis 1 and 2 establishes man's rule over women. Complementarians do. Most complementarians believe that the woman's subjection to the man did not start in Genesis 3. It started in Genesis 1 and 2, especially Genesis 2. So they see Genesis 3 when God says your desire should be for your husband and he shall rule over you. They see this as not the beginning of man's rule, but a reaffirmation of that rule. This is seen as, quote, even though Eve broke out from Adam's leadership even though Eve broke out from Adam's leadership, God in this verse is reaffirming his original purpose and the intent of Adam's rule. Let me read to you again from The Flame of Yahweh, page 61 and 62. He has a lot of this information in here. Flame of Yahweh, 61, 62. So this reaffirmation of man's authority, not the beginning of it, but this is the reaffirmation of his leadership, of his headship. Dr. Richard Davison says, quote, according to the evangelical version of this view, Eve, at the fall, had broken loose from her role of submission to Adam and is now redirected to her former position under the leadership of Adam, not as a punishment, but as a continued blessing and comfort to her in her difficulties as a mother. The meaning of verse 16 may be paraphrased as, you will have labor and difficulty in your motherhood, yet you will be eager, that is, you will desire for your husband, and he will rule over you, in the sense of servant leadership to care for and help, and not in the sense of domination and oppression. So there are those who see this as a blessing. It's a reaffirmation of man's rule over the woman. And again, there are those who say, well, and God had to do this because she broke out from under Adam's authority. Now she's going to have this desire to want to resist his authority and have dominion over him. So what God has done is reestablish the man's authority, but it's for her benefit. It's for her blessing. Now, the idea is women are going to break out, and the man lovingly is to bring her back under his headship, his authority, his rule. So it's for her benefit. The woman is still rebellious, but God has a solution. He provided the man as the leader to bring the woman back into submission. That is an interpretation that some believe, some hold to this day. All right. So the reaffirmation of headship interpretation. Another one, some people see this verse, your desire should be for your husband and he should rule over you. They see it as exaggerated, unhealthy desire. Let me read again. Flame of Yahweh. This is from page 60. They see this as exaggerated or unhealthy desire. This is page 60. And two scholars, Carl F. Keel and Franz Delitzsch, who were Hebrew scholars, they understood the original position of man-woman as rule subordination, rooted in mutual esteem and love. So before the fall, it was supposed to be a rule subordination. Man rules over the woman, but it's rooted in mutual esteem and love. So even though the man rules, they love each other, they value each other. But they argue that after sin, so after what we call the fall, the woman has, quote, a desire bordering on disease, and the husband exercises despotic rule over his wife. Let me read the rest of it. H.C. Leopold describes a morbid yearning on the part of the woman after the fall that has, quote, that has often, quote, taken a perverted form, even to the point of nymphomania. Okay, wow. So again, this is saying the woman has the problem. She has a desire that is exaggerated to the point that it's unhealthy. It borders on disease. And it's so perverted even to the point of nymphomania. It's like she becomes a sexual addict. You know, so again, it's seeing the woman somehow or another, the woman's desire is perverted. The woman is the problem. But they do say that the man, because of this desire bordering on disease, he has to exercise a despotic rule over his wife. So that's the exaggerated, unhealthy desire interpretation of the text. And then there is one that Richard M. Davison calls God's normative pattern for marriage after the fall. This is another way of looking at it. This is God's normative pattern, his normal pattern for man and woman after the fall. Let me read to you again. I don't know why I'm keep closing this book, but page 63 of Flame of Yahweh. And he says this, that Genesis 3:16 is to be understood as prescriptive and not just descriptive. That this is he's saying that there are those who interpret this as this is what God says must be. This is basically like God's instruction or God's command. This verse presents husband leadership and wife submission as God's normative pattern for the marriage relationship after the fall. So this is the normal way that it's supposed to be. Whether or not this is good or bad, it does not say, but this is the normal relationship. This is the way it is understood to be. And then finally, one more, Dr. Richard M. Davison himself gives another interpretation, which is his view. This is on page 76 of the book. He gives his view of this. And he says, I suggest a seventh interpretation of Genesis 3:16, one that combines elements from 5 and 6 above. These are different ones. But he says that this is a qualified, prescriptive divine sentence announcing the voluntary submission of the wife to her husband's servant leadership as a result of sin. So he sees this, the way he interprets it is that, yes, God lays this out. God says this is how it's supposed to be. It is supposed to be, though, the voluntary submission of the wife to her husband's servant leadership as a result of sin. So because of sin, let me go and read. He says, this involves, however, not so much a negative judgment as a positive promised blessing of divine grace designed to lead back as much as possible to the original plan of harmony and union between equal partners without hierarchy. So Dr. Davison, in his book, understands his view is that Genesis 1 and 2 does not speak of hierarchy. God did not create a hierarchy in the beginning. God did not make the man over to rule over the woman or to be her leader in the beginning. They are to be co-equal partners. But after the fall, he states, now the woman is to voluntarily submit herself to the man as a result of the fall, and he is to provide a loving servant leadership. He sees this is the way it is supposed to be. So it is not they fail and man gets to rule over the woman and she really has no say so in the matter. It is because of sin, she is now to yield herself in submission to the man, and the man is to provide loving servant leadership to the woman. And as much as possible, they should try to get back to the original plan of harmony and union between equal partners without hierarchy. Though there is a hierarchy, they're to try to get as close as possible as they can to God's original point of view. He goes on to say, let me read to you from his footnote on page 76. This is footnote 69 for those of you that are interested in such things. He said, I see God's leadership appointment for the man in Genesis 3:16 as somewhat like my role as department chair at my seminary. In all committees, at least those constituted after the fall, there needs to be a facilitator, the committee chair. And in a committee of equal numbers, there must be some way to break a deadlock tie vote. Excuse me. So God has designated the husband as facilitator and tiebreaker to maintain union and preserve harmony of the home, a committee of two. The chair, at least in my department, has no power to control the department members. He is the first among equals, with the unenviable task of doing the busy work to facilitate the smooth performance of the department. So the husband, as first among equals in the home, as Genesis 3:16 seems to imply, gets to be first. And then he defines what he means by first. First to say, I'm sorry. First to offer to take out the garbage and to do other disagreeable jobs. First to take responsibility if something goes wrong. Quote, the husband is to be the first to bleed on behalf of the person whom he has been called to protect, his wife. To be the head is to lead by sacrificing first for all who are called to serve. He's quoting from a book by Dan B. Allender and Trimper Longman, Intimate Allies, Recovering God's Design for Marriage and Becoming Soulmates for Life. And then Dr. Davidson goes on to say, at the same time, just as committee works best by consensus, and it may rarely or never be necessary for the committee chair to break a tie vote as the members serve together in a harmonious union. He says, I write as a department chair who has the privilege of working with such departmental members, so the husband leadership may rarely need to be exercised in the sense of tie breaking or wife's submission. He says on page 76, as already pointed out, the context of Genesis 3:16 reveals that it is entirely appropriate for marriage partners to seek to return as much as possible. And notice that, to seek to return as much as possible to total egalitarianism in the marriage relationship. So while he is stating that what he believes Genesis 3:16 is saying is that, okay, the husband is to rule, the wife is to submit voluntarily to that rule, to his leadership. However, the way it should function and operate is that they work together for consensus as much as possible. They are equals. They are to work as consensus as much as possible. But if it doesn't happen, the husband is the tiebreaker. The husband has the final say. This is what you call a soft complementarian view. So this is still a soft complementarian view with a hierarchy where ultimately, in truth, the man is in charge and the woman is submitted to his rule. But what he's saying here is that the woman, and the reason man has the rule is to promote harmony. He is to promote unity within the relationship. Now, Genesis 3:16 does say, your desire should be for your husband and he shall rule over you. We're just looking at how has this been understood? How has this been interpreted through the centuries? So we've looked at a contemporary one of Richard M. Davison. He believes, yes, the husband is to, from the fall on, the husband is to be a servant leader. He has provided this for protection of the home, for harmony within the home. The wife is to voluntarily yield herself. This is what's, excuse me, what some people will call a very soft complementarian view, though Dr. Davidson is saying that you should be, as much as possible, seeking for an egalitarian, a return to the original egalitarian position as established in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Okay, so that's his view. Now, let me say this, and it's to preserve harmony in the home. I think that's one of the better views. However, I do have some problems with this view. So let me say number one, the other views I do not see as valid. I don't believe, and if you've been following me for so long, all of the other views I talked about, especially the one that she has an exaggerated slavish desire, she's almost like a nymphomaniac, or she is going to do whatever her husband wants. That shows the woman as being all the problem. It puts women in a very bad light. And to be honest with you, this is not something that I see among women. You know, I've grown up, I've raised 3 daughters. I'm married to a very strong woman. I've had strong women in my life. I was raised by my grandmother. I was raised by my aunt. I was raised by my mother. On my dad's side, I had two strong women who were part of the raising of my process. One thing, now, while they could stand their ground, I never saw them as being slavish or having a desire that bordered on being a nymphomaniac. Now, the reason I bring this out, because you have to understand, what is Genesis for? The purpose of Genesis is an etiology. It is to explain why are things the way that they are. And when we look at women, some people say, well, Mike, I do see some women being slavish towards their husband. It's like, whatever you want, I'll be with you. We call that maybe codependency. I just do whatever you want, just don't leave me. Yeah, that's some women, though. It's not all women. Mike, there are some women who are contentious with their husband. Yes, that's some women, just like there are some men who are contentious with their wives. There are some men who are like, I will do whatever you want me to do. I don't think looking at those examples, those helps to explain Genesis 3:16, because we don't see it across the board. And I don't think we see it when we look at the biblical text. I don't think we see it when we look at ancient Near Eastern culture, especially in Israel, which we're going to be getting more into. We don't see these type of things happening. And remember, the purpose of Genesis is to explain how we got where we are, especially for the people of Israel. How are we in the position? How are we in the condition? How do we have the culture that we have? That is what Genesis is supposed to do, more so for Israel than for anyone else. Remember, one of the interpretive principles that we are operating by. While the Bible is for us, it was not originally written to us. Who was it originally written to? Well, when we're looking at the Hebrew scriptures, it was originally written to the Israelites. It wasn't originally written to the Canaanites. It wasn't originally written to the Jebusites. It wasn't originally written to any of the other ites. Though it reflects ancient Near Eastern culture in many different ways, it was originally written to Israel to help explain their origins and why they experience life and culture as they do. We've got to keep that in mind. One of the principles, if you go back to the first 3 messages, I talked about the contextual frames that we have to operate by. So we're going back to that again. We can't forget that. I don't see some of the other interpretations that have been proposed. I don't see that in Israel. I'm not saying it didn't happen with certain people, but I'm saying across the board, for women in general, we don't see that. I don't see that in my wife. I don't see that in my daughters. I don't see that. I didn't see that with my mom. I didn't see that with my aunts. I didn't see that with my mom's sister, my aunt who helped raise me. I call her my aunt Pat. I call her my other mother. My grandmother, Bernice Warnell, that we call Nita, my beloved grandmother. They were not like that. You know, I did not see the women in my family growing up as contentious. Now, that doesn't mean they never had a problem with other people or other men, but they were not consistently contentious women. Now, I have seen women who are contentious. I have seen men who are contentious. But is this what this passage is trying to say is what is true of all women? No. Is it saying that what is true of all women is that they have this slavish desire to do whatever their husbands want? No, because I didn't see that either in the women that I grew up around. I don't see that in the biblical text. Are they saying that they have this this desire that borders on a disease where they become almost nymphomaniacs. No. So I don't think this is what this passage is saying, because we don't see this in the biblical text. We see this in things outside of scripture, where you have certain rabbis commenting on women and other people, what we call post-biblical texts and post-biblical doctrine. They say these type of things, but when we look in the Bible, we don't see these things. Okay. So, and also with Dr. Davidson's position, while I do appreciate what he said, I do have some problems with it. And see, where's my notes at? Oh, here it is. First of all, I question when he says this is the husband is given the servant leadership role to establish harmony in the home. My question is this, because like I said, I question this: why must the husband be the one to maintain harmony? Why interpret it in this way? Because what the passage says, your desire should be for your husband and he shall rule over you. That's all the passage says. The passage does not say your desire should be for your husband and he shall rule over you to maintain harmony in the home. That's not what the passage says. So why is the husband the one to maintain harmony? And besides, Genesis 3:16 says, again, nothing about the husband maintaining harmony. It just says that he will rule over you. And we could also ask, why couldn't the wife be the one to maintain the harmony? Because it's her desire that's directed towards her husband. So if her desire is towards her husband, one of the ways we could read this, if this was about who's establishing the harmony, we could say, well, the one that's being directed towards the husband, towards the spouse, is the wife. Maybe she's the one who's maintaining the harmony. Why does it have to be the husband? I'm not saying that the husband can't maintain harmony. I'm not saying that he's not maintaining harmony. I'm saying, why interpret it that way when nothing in the text actually says that the husband is given the servant rule in order to maintain harmony. Next week, we're going to talk about the word there for rule, mashal. We'll talk about more next week what that word means and what it does not mean, okay? But this is the difficulty I have with Dr. Davidson's position, though it's leaning more towards egalitarianism. He promotes that. However, I look at it and I go, where in the text does it say that the husband is given the servant leadership role? It doesn't even say he's given a servant leadership role. It just says the husband is to rule over you without really defining the type of rule that it is. So where are we pulling from to say he gets to be the servant rule in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16? Okay, so that's why I have some difficulty with it. And again, I don't see the other interpretations as valid. So let's talk some more about this verse and look at it a little bit more in context, okay? Now, just to say again, I do highly value Dr. Richard M. Davidson's book and a lot of his research. We've been quoting from it from almost the beginning of starting this passage. I just disagree with him there for the reasons that I just gave. There are some scholars, two scholars, one by the name of Carol Myers and the other one named Joy Fleming. They see and they interpreted Genesis chapter 3:16 in different ways than most commentators and most translators. So first of all, let's go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 again, where it says, because I believe that there is another way to look at this text to better understand what's being communicated. So we're going to look at some interpretation, some understanding of this text from Dr. Carol Myers and Dr. Joy Fleming, biblical scholars. Again, it says, Genesis 3:16, the first part, God says to the woman, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. Some verses, some translations read, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your childbearing. Okay, I will greatly multiply your sorrow in your childbearing, or I will greatly multiply your pain in your childbearing. So most of us have read this, myself included, until I came across this information as, well, the reason women have pain in childbirth is because of Eve and the judgment that came upon her from what God said in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, I will greatly multiply your sorrow or your pain in childbearing, right? That's how you understood the text. That's how I understood the text for almost 3 decades, a little over 3 decades. Is there another way, though, to understand this passage? And yes, there is. First of all, the words, note the words when he says, I will greatly multiply. Now, my New King James says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. Part of this verse, the New King James Version really gets right. I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. Now, the words sorrow and I will greatly multiply your sorrow. So I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. Most translations and most commentators on Genesis 3:16 take this as a hendiadys, Hendiadys. What is a hendiasis? A hendiasis is two words or two phrases connected by a conjunction or connected by the conjunction and to emphasize one single point. You connect two words or two phrases together with the conjunction and in order to emphasize a point. For example, if I said to you, man, this coat that I'm wearing, it's nice and warm. That's a hendiadys, okay? Nice and warm. What am I saying? Oh, this is really cozy. This is really nice. It's keeping me warm. But notice I use two words, nice and warm. I could have just said this coat is warm. But I go, it's nice and warm. So I'm emphasizing that it's really warm and it's pleasurable, right? If I say to you, wow, it's raining cats and dogs outside, that is itself a figure of speech, and a hendiadys is a figure of speech. It's raining cats and dogs. What am I saying? Am I saying it's literally raining cats and dogs? No. Am I saying that it's raining cats and dogs? No. I'm saying it's really raining hard out there. To say it's raining cats and dogs is the hendiadys. And it's emphasizing a point. It's really raining hard out there. So when we see God saying, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception, many scholars, Hebraic scholars, take this multiply sorrow and conception, they take it as a hendiadys, and most translation take it as a hendiadys, and they see it as emphasizing one point, one thought. What is it? You're going to have painful labor when you have your baby. When you have babies, you're going to go through a lot of pain. So that's how they see and they translate this word. I looked up Flame of Yahweh, Richard Davidson. He sees it this way. I looked at Victor Furnish Hamilton, who's another scholar. He sees it this way. I think John Walton sees it this way. I think. Don't hold me to that. But different scholars, and I saw different references of different scholars, this is how they see it. But Myers and Fleming's in their work, and Dr. Carol Myers wrote a book called Rediscovering Eve, Ancient Israelite Women in Context. Fascinating book, one I highly recommend because it gives some great insights. And then Dr. Joy Fleming wrote a book called Men and Women in Biblical Unity. Now, in their work, both of them state that this phrase, I would greatly multiply your sorrow and your childbearing or your conception, it doesn't have to be translated this way. Matter of fact, so let me read to you for a moment from their work. This is, let me read to you from, let me make sure I'm on the right place here. Dr. Carol Myers' book for this is from Rediscovering Eve, page 89, paragraph 2. You know, I have my sources quoted. Okay, where is it at here? Okay, there we go. Let me make sure I'm on the right page here. So I have to switch between screens. Yeah, page 89. Okay, so Dr. Carol Myers says on page 89 of her book, Rediscovering Eve, Ancient Israelite Women in Context, always got to keep it in context. She says, hendiadys in this verse is possible. Talking about Genesis 3:16. She's talking about, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. She said a hendiadys in this verse is possible, but it's not necessary. Okay, it's possible, but it's not necessary. All right, so then let me read to you from, and that's just one quote there, but I'm going to come back to her in just a second. Wait a minute, I didn't quote everything. Let me go back. Okay, she goes on to say, let me just read it all. It says, the Septuagint quoted above, she quoted from the Septuagint, uses a compound direct object. This gets into the linguistics and language, the grammar. Thy pains and thy sighing. So does the Vulgate. Your toils, the Vulgate, which is a Latin version of the Old Testament, says your toils and your conceptions. Now, the Vulgate was translated into Latin by one of the I believe the church fathers, Jerome, who was a Hebraeus, he knew Hebrew, he translated this as your toils and your conceptions. That's important. I'm going to come back to that. She said the King James Version says, thy sorrow and thy conception. None use childbirth for the second noun in this line. Does that second noun really mean childbirth? So when it says conception, probably not. Now, again, most of us read it when it says, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy childbirth. We think of it as, or thy conception, we think of it as the labor, bringing forth the child. And we go, well, yeah, Mike, I can see when one woman is having a child, she's in a lot of pain. But does the word mean childbirth? She says, probably not. For one thing, the Hebrew Bible has a fairly nuanced vocabulary for the stages of procreation, with separate terms for conception, pregnancy, labor, and delivery. This is true. I looked them up. Okay. So Hebrew has specific terms for conception, for pregnancy, for labor, and delivery. So different terms for the different stages. The second noun, or the word that's translated when it says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your, some translations say labor, some say your childbirth. My Bible says conception. Conception is correct. The second noun, which is haron in Hebrew, means pregnancy, not birth. It means pregnancy, not birth. So when it says, I will greatly multiply your sorrows and your conceptions, the word there is not talking about bringing forth children in labor. It's talking about conceiving a child. She said this term is often used with terms for sexual intercourse. It signifies the beginning of pregnancy, as when Abraham had sex with Hagar, and she became pregnant in Genesis chapter 16, verse 4. Okay. So let me go to what. So that's Dr. Carol Myers. So what she is saying here is that this term, and I can vouch for this because I went and looked it up in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. I'll quote to you what they've just said in a moment. I looked it up in the Theological Dictionary of Old Testament exegesis that I have, of theology and exegesis. Looked it up in Strong's, looked it up in Genesis. This word that says, I will multiply your sorrow and your conception does not mean labor. It doesn't mean to give birth, it means to become pregnant. All right, let me read to you what Dr. Joy Fleming says in her book, which is called, what's her book called? Man and Women in Biblical Unity. This is from, I have the Kindle version, so this is Kindle location 560. Let me find it here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so she says here in paragraph 4, the first 4 words in Genesis 3:16 are not arranged to indicate a hendiadys. A hendiadys is not required by the syntax or grammar. It is not required. It can be, but it's not required. Nor is it necessary to impose one to make the meaning clear. Furthermore, there are a number of difficulties with translating these words as a hendiadys, including the problem of conflating 2 distinct and important ideas, one positive idea and one negative idea, into a single, very negative statement. And then there is the problem created by changing the meaning of one of the words, haron. Okay, so what is being said here? Both Dr. Fleming and Dr. Myers says, hey, we've got a problem with the way we're translating this, because the word translated sometimes as labor or childbearing is actually the word for conception, not the word for bringing forth the child, but the word for becoming pregnant with the child. As a matter of fact, so the word translated as childbirth in some translation is the word haron, and it's not referring to birth, but to conception. The Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, number 555, 555, page 223 of the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, it says that haron or heriayon means conception or pregnancy. The article in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament goes on to state 3 words are used in relation to the birth process. Hara, to conceive, which we get haron from. yalad, to bear or give birth, and hul, to labor in giving birth. So notice, again, this is what Dr. Meyer said. There are certain words that are used specifically for the birthing process. There is hara or haron, to conceive. There is yalad, Y-A-L-A-D, yalad, to bear or to give birth. So that's giving birth. That word is actually used, yalad, when it says, let me read to you, go back to Genesis chapter 3. So when it says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception, that word there is heryayon, or which comes from haron, which means conception. I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conceiving, not your birth, you're conceiving. Then it says, in pain you shall bring forth. Now the word bring forth there is talking about birthing, and it is the word yalad. So it is talking in the second sentence, in pain you shall bring forth yalad, you shall yalad children, you shall bring them forth. So the second line does talk about bringing forth children, but the first line is talking about conceiving the children. You see the difference? Conception, then birth. So according to the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, the first word hara describes the inception. Hara is used to state the results of sexual intercourse. So hara is used to describe the result of sexual intercourse. What is the result of sexual intercourse? You conceive and you have a baby. The result of sexual intercourse is not immediately birth. It is you conceive the child. Yalad is the bringing forth of the child. So Myers and Fleming's, again, they also note this in their work. So let me read to you from Myers again, page 89. Let me read what she says in her work here. And where is it? I'm sorry, I lost it. Oh, okay. She says, the second mind develops the first. In other words, in pain you shall bring forth children. So the second line develops the first, augmenting it in some way, but not repeating it. Okay? This is what we call a Hebrew parallelism. So it's augmenting it, but it's not repeating it. So you're in your sorrow you shall conceive, and then in pain you shall bring forth. So the second line develops the first, augmenting it in some way. The mention of bearing children in the second line thus precludes a reference to childbirth in the first line. Again, for the first line, pregnancy is a better translation of haron. God is proclaiming, and we'll see this in just a moment, that women will have numerous pregnancies. So when it says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow in your conception, she's saying God is proclaiming that women will have numerous pregnancies, not that that is going to be in that first line, not saying she's going to have a painful birth. And you say, well, what's significant about that? Can you prove that? Yes, hang on for just a moment. Let me read to you again now from, now this is just in the mouth of two or three witnesses. This is from Fleming. This read to you from Carol Myers. This is from Fleming, page 560. Oops, something came up on my computer here. Let me take that off. Something is, okay. So page 560, paragraph, where am I at? Paragraph 2. Yeah, she said the text indicates that God is going to multiply not one, but two things. He's going to multiply not one, but two things. What is it? God is saying, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow, that's one, and I will greatly multiply thy conception. She says the final word of the phrase haron means conception or pregnancy, not childbirth. So she again says the same thing. It means pregnancy or conception, not childbirth. Okay? All right, so according to these two scholars, and if you go look up these words, because I wouldn't look them up in the Hebrew with the dictionaries and lexicons that I have, they say this word means, it refers to, and every time it's used, it refers to the result of intercourse, which is conception. It does not refer to the bringing forth of a child. Did you know that? Okay, so let's go on here. So God is not talking about multiplying pain in the birthing of children. He's not talking about labor pains. I'm going to multiply your labor pains in that verse when he says, I will greatly multiply your sorrows in your conception and your conceptions, or greatly multiply your sorrows and your conception. He's not saying I'm going to multiply your labor pains. That's not what's being said. He's not talking about he's talking about the conception of a child. Now, somebody said, well, are you saying that God is saying, I will multiply your pain in conceiving a child? There's really no pain in conceiving a child. Right. There's no pain in conceiving a child. So is God talking about labor pains here? I'm glad you caught that. Okay. So what is the multiplying the sorrow and pain about then? Because conception is not painful. Bringing forth the child can, not when you're carrying a child, because I know I've had 3 of them. I didn't carry them. Karen did. There is discomfort when you're carrying the child. There is discomfort and pain for many women when they birth the child, not all, but for many women. But the conception of the child is not painful. So what is this multiplying the sorrow, pain, and about then? Okay. First, the word sorrow or pain in Hebrew is the word isabon. Isabon. It is the word used of Adam in Genesis chapter 3, verse 17. Let's go back to Genesis. Let's look at verse 16 and then read it down in context. Verse 17 to read in context. Then to Adam, God said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Notice that, in toil you shall eat of it. This is the same word when it says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow in verse 16. The word toil there is isabon. And while the word can mean physical pain, it is used most often of mental pain or anguish or anxiety. The Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament says it refers to pain-filled labor. This is on page 483, number 675 of the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. Isabon refers to pain-filled labor, inner pain, toilsome work that is generally true of human existence. Toilsome work. This is what God is saying to Adam. You, because of your sin, the ground is cursed for your sake, and it will be toilsome for you to eat from it, to bring forth. It says, both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. So notice, it's going to be toil here. It's going to be physically exhausting. It can even be physically painful in terms of the amount of work that he's going to have to do, and it will bring some anxiety. This is what this word is implying and pointing to and meaning. So again, let me read to you from Mayer's work again, page 89, paragraph 4a. Page 89, Carol Mayer's work, Rediscovering Eve. Let me make sure I'm on the right page here. Yeah. Okay. She says, when she talks about isabon, she said, what about the first noun isabon? If it means pain, as most translations indicate, the first line would be proclaiming a painful pregnancy. Yet normal pregnancies involve discomfort, but are not particularly painful, unless there's some special circumstances. And that's me saying that. No biblical, like my wife had pain because as the kids were getting bigger in her, she would get very bad sciatica. But that's discomfort of the pregnancy itself, not the conception. Okay? Normal pregnancies involve discomfort, but are not particularly painful, and no biblical passage mentions pregnancy, the conceiving of a child, associated with pain. If pregnancy is the better translation of the second noun, then the first one cannot be pain. In fact, isabon never means childbirth pain in other biblical texts. She says, then what does it mean? Its verbal form appears 15 times in the Hebrew, and it refers to emotional or mental distress, not physical pain. Let's see. Where did I want to go from here? Let me check. Oh, okay. She says, because isabon means toil, not pain. This is on page, now I'm on page 90. Because isabon means toil, not pain, and not simply work, in the passages in which it appears, the isabon or the toil proclaimed for the woman in the first line of 3:16 simply denotes exhausting physical labor. Woman out of Eden will work hard and also have many pregnancies. God is mandating woman's role in production and reproduction. And remember, I told you before about the Latin Vulgate written by Jerome? It understood it this way. Jerome wrote, and she says he was a good Hebraist, though he was misogynistic in some of the things he said about women. She said, I will multiply, he wrote, I will multiply your toils and your conceptions. He understood labor rather than pain as pregnancies. He understood labor rather than seeing it as pain. He understood it as labor rather than, he understood this Isabon when God was talking to the woman as labor rather than pain in pregnancy. And he saw the pregnant, when it says she'll be conceived, he saw this as the pregnancy, conceiving children, not as childbirth. Okay, even though later on in his commentary he mentions pain, but he translated it as I will bring you will toil, I will multiply your toils and your conceptions. Okay, so Meyer is saying this word doesn't mean labor in pain or pain in laboring or bringing forth your child. It's not used that way in the Hebrew of the Bible. It simply means work. And what God is saying is, I'm going to, in the context of the women, you're going to have exhausting work. That women outside of Eden, now this is after the fall, women will work hard and also have many pregnancies. God is maintaining a woman's role in production and reproduction. Now, first of all, many of you women may be looking at me right now going, ooh, child, I know you right, because I work hard, I got these babies, and I work hard. That's actually closer to what's going on in the culture of the day. Women worked, and we're going to see this next week as we look more at the context, because keep in mind, this was written not originally to us. It was originally written to women who lived in an agrarian or farming society, where they were part of the production and where also they would reproduce children. Women were part of they took part in the farming task. We'll see this next week, along with the men. So keep in mind, this is an ancient Near Eastern text that we are dealing with. It is not a 21st century text, yet though, and there are scholars who have said this, the idea of women working outside of the home and helping to raise children is closer to what was going on in ancient times more than we realize. In modern times, at one point, people would say women should not work outside the home, women should be at home. And I've seen some scholars say, well, actually, when you start to look at what was actually taking place, women were working, quote, outside of the home. Well, specifically, the work was at the home. So was the work of the men, but they were working alongside the men. They were not only just involved in reproduction in terms of having children, they were involved in production, making sure that the family had enough to eat, making sure that the family had enough to wear, making sure that the family had enough to drink. This was part of their toil. Remember, what Genesis is doing is explaining, why are we experiencing life as we do? Why are these things that we're currently experiencing, why are they the way that they are? So this toil, this exhausting toil, this concern, this anxiety about are we going to have enough to eat? Because this was a real concern in the ancient world. Are we going to have enough to eat? Is the crops going to bring forth this year? Is it going to be enough to sustain our family? These were real concerns in the ancient world. Now, somebody say, it's real concern today, especially now, Mike, in the world that we live in, especially for those of us that are here in America, all the inflation going on. Am I going to have enough gas? Am I going to have? Well, the anxiety Genesis is telling us, and the toilsome, the exhaustive, toilsome work, Genesis explains where it comes from, especially Genesis 3:16 for the woman. This is what's being established here. This is showing us why they were experiencing, or showing the people back then, this is why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. It is the result of the fall. It is the judgment of the fall. Does that make sense? He's not saying to Eve at this point in Genesis 3:16, when it says, I will multiply your sorrows and your conception, he is not saying, based upon the work of Carol Myers and Joy Fleming, I am going to multiply your pain when you are bringing forth your children, because the word there for childbirth is not childbirth, as some translations say, it is the word for pregnancy. Pregnancy, when you conceive a child, is not in pain. God and people, women don't, as a rule, experience when they conceive a child, they experience great pain. That doesn't happen. So that's not what the verse is saying. And again, there are specific words for conceiving a child, bringing forth a child, and laboring in birth. Specific words for that. The word used here, heron or what's the word? Let me go back. The word that's being specifically used here, heriayon, is meaning, it means conception or to conceive a child. Okay, the result of sexual intercourse. That's the word that's being used here. So God is not talking about multiplying pain in laboring and bringing forth a child and childbirth. The word that's used here was used of Adam. It is toil. It is pain-filled labor. It is exhausting labor. Fleming goes on to say the best understanding of God's word to the woman in 3:16 is that he is speaking of the same kind of toil when he speaks to the man. Toil to work the ground which the Lord has cursed. The reason the toil is exhausting is because of the curse on the ground. It is not bringing forth for the man, for humanity, as it did before. Let me say it again. It's not bringing forth for humanity as it did before. Romans chapter 8 talks about the fact that creation has been subjugated. It's not experiencing its full liberty. And it was because of the curse of Adam. So because of the curse of Adam, at times it seems like what people experience is scarcity. It is not growing. It is not producing. It is not bringing forth, which brings with it anxiety. And so you have to work extremely hard. Talking about within an agrarian society, let's stay within context. You have to work extremely hard to work that land to bring forth. And everybody was involved in farming. Everyone was involved in terms of the family in working the land. It just wasn't the husband. So this is why Carol Meyer's work is so important, because she brings the ancient Near Eastern, the ancient Israelite and ancient Near Eastern context to this passage. Okay, so let me go on here. God says, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and your conception. What does this mean? What does he mean by I will greatly multiply in Genesis 3:16? In Hebrew, it says actually, again, you can look this up. In Hebrew, it is not I will greatly multiply. That is a translation of the Hebrew to make it more, to make where it makes more sense to us in English. In Hebrew, it is multiplying, I will multiply. Multiplying, I will multiply thy sorrow and thy conceptions. Multiplying, I will multiply thy sorrows and thy conceptions. In Hebrew, the word multiply is repeated twice. Why? You do this for emphasis. You want to emphasize something in Hebrew, you repeat it twice. Sometimes you repeat a word twice for emphasis. It helps to augment it. It helps to make a strong point. We see this. This is when you need your Bibles. Go to Genesis chapter 22. We see this in Genesis chapter 22. Again, I am indebted to the work of Dr. Carol Myers and Dr. Joy Fleming for bringing this to my attention. Genesis chapter 22, we're going to look at verse 15. This is when God has taken Isaac, not God, Abraham has taken Isaac, and he was going to sacrifice Isaac because God had spoke to him. Verse 15, it says, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. And here's verse 17. Blessing, I will bless you. And multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Notice here in the New King James, it says, I will multiplying, I will multiply your descendants. In Hebrew, it is the same as it is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, where it says, I will multiply your sorrow. It's the same in Hebrew. Multiplying, I will multiply. Here God says to Abraham, multiplying, I will multiply your descendants. In other words, God was saying, absolutely, certainly now, I will multiply your descendants. I will increase. I will give you numerous children. Notice it is said within the context of multiplying numerous children. Where do we first see the idea of women having to multiply, or the human race having to multiply? Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. What does God say to the man and woman? Go forth, be fruitful, and multiply. This was the mandate given in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. So multiplying is a good thing. God is the source of the multiplying, because it says he blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. God is the source of the multiplying. Now, let's tie this all together. So in Genesis chapter 3, when God says, multiplying, I will multiply, let me say this first. Genesis chapter 22, verse 15 through 27, God says to Abraham in the New King James, multiply and I will multiply. The New King James basically says it the way the Hebrew says it. Blessing, I will bless you. Multiply and I will multiply. God is saying it is certain, it's absolute. And he's emphasizing, I will bless you. You will be multiply. You will grow. Your descendants will grow. The Net Bible, the New English Translation says, I will indeed bless you and I will greatly multiply your descendants. They just make it more simple in English. The ESV says, I will surely multiply your offspring. The idea is that God will surely do it. He will make Abraham numerous, the children, because the multiplying is spoken in the context of children. So God in each passage is speaking of children, numerous children being multiplied. Why? Because numerous children are considered a blessing in ancient Near Eastern and especially Hebraic or Israelite thought. Numerous children are considered a blessing. Go to Psalms 127. Psalms 127, 127th Psalm, and let's look at verse 3. Psalms 127, verse 3. Now we're breaking this down because we ultimately will come back around and say, what is Genesis 3 saying about man and the woman ruling over the man? Is it saying that the woman has a negative desire? I've already said no, but we're giving some more insight so we can better understand what's being said and what is not being said, okay? It's gonna take 2 lessons to bring it all together. All right, Psalms 127. I hope you're getting something out of this. It says in verse 3, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man, blessed, ashrei, in a state of blessedness is the man, the man who, happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. So the man who has a quiver, a household full of children, he's considered in a state of blessedness, a state of truly flourishing. It was considered a blessing to have a lot of children. They shall not be ashamed, the man, the person who has a quiver full of children, they shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. To not have children was considered shameful. To have a lot of children was considered a great honor. Children, by both men and women, to have a lot of children was seen as a blessing. You see this in the story and the competition between Rebecca and her sister Leah. And you see how every time Leah has children, she kind of rejoices and she praises God. And God has taken away my reproach. God has blessed me. And when Rebecca doesn't have any children, or Sarah doesn't have any children, they're like, hey, this is reproach. Take away my reproach. And you have the husband going, who am I, God? Can I determine who opens the womb, who closes the womb? I'm not God. And the women were distressed over not having children. To not have children in the ancient Near East, in Israelite culture, was considered shameful. To have a lot of children, it was considered you were a person of prominence. You were a woman of prominence, a woman of honor, a man of honor if you had a lot of children, especially if you had a lot of boys. But if you had a lot of children, that was considered to be, man, you were a person of prominence, you were a person of honor, you were highly esteemed within your culture, okay? Now, we see this in Psalms 127, verse 3 and 4. Why are a quiver full of children, a lot of children, numerous children, considered a blessing? Well, we'll get to that. Okay. In Genesis 3:16, what is God saying he's going to multiply? According to Myers and according to Fleming, he's going to multiply 2 things. One, he's going to multiply the toil, the work. She will have to work the land like her husband, and it's not going to be easy. God tells the husband in verse 17. Remember, we just read it. It will be exhausting. And at times it will be anxiety filled. The word Isabon can mean mental anguish and pain, as well as tiring physical labor. So one of the things he's going to multiply is the toil that the man and the woman have to do outside of the garden their work, their toil is going to be multiplied. It's going to be exhausting. But then number two, he said he is going to multiply not her labor pains, but her conceptions. He's going to multiply her pregnancies. What did God tell them to do in Genesis chapter 1? Be fruitful and multiply. He says, I am going to multiply, one, your work, but two, I'm going to multiply your conception. I'm going to multiply your pregnancies. In other words, God is saying to Eve and to women in the ancient Near East, I'm going to give you a lot of babies. I'm going to give you a lot of children. That would be considered not a curse, ladies. That would be considered, if we're living in the ancient Near East, a blessing. Again, in ancient Near Eastern thought, in Hebraic thought, this is a blessing, not a curse. The exhausting physical toil is the result of the curse, but having many children is considered a blessing. Why are many children a blessing? In the ancient Near East, why are many children a blessing in ancient Israelite culture? And how does this connect with exhausting physical toil? Why put the two together? I'm going to tell you why. Carol Myers, in her book again, Rediscovering Eve, Women in Ancient Near Eastern and Ancient Israelite Context, she gives us some cultural insights that really open my eyes. So let me read to you again from her book. This is the wrong one. I'm going to read to you from page 97. Let me pull it up here. There we go. I gotta go over to page 97. Here we go. Okay, so she says, let me find, okay, she says, quote, let me just make sure this is the right place I want to be first. Yeah, okay, that's right, where I want to be. Okay, paragraph 3. Okay, I'm just going to start here. Genesis 3:16, similarly, no, that's not where I want to start. Okay, the difficulties that people would face etiologically originate in God's punitive proclamation that men face arduous agricultural labor on land with compromised fertility. Meaning, what God said to Adam, the ground is cursed for your sake, so now it is going to be painful toil for you to extract from this land to get what you need to survive. Genesis 3:16, talking about the women, similarly mandates labor for women, but they must also bear many children. In traditional societies everywhere, peasant women are both workers and mothers. The Eden narrative sees both these female roles as onerous, and disobedience in the garden is the etiological cause. In other words, this can be a burden, and the cause of it is what happened in the garden. Now, let me go on and see what she says here. It does not require much imagination, given the importance of leisure time and activities in our own lives, to understand why Israelite peasants of both genders would find unending days of toil unwelcome. But women generally have positive feelings about producing offspring. What makes the second of these procreation so problematic? Okay, now I don't want to get into that yet. I'm going to come back to that next week. He says, for most agrarians, this is what I want to talk about. As for most agrarians or farmers, children were important for several reasons. This is what I was supposed to read. Children are important for several reasons. They were an essential part of the household workforce, especially because of the labor-intensive periods of Israelite cropping patterns. Agrarians facing significant environmental constraints usually attempt to increase crop yields by cultivating more fields, thus securing additional resources for lean years. Their labor needs would then increase. So if they're going to get more land and plant more crops, they're going to cultivate more fields and plant more crops, this is going to require more labor. Where do they get the labor from? Their labor needs would then increase, pushing households towards a larger number of offspring. Children were also needed because as adults, they cared for parents who survived into old age. There were no senior citizens for the elders. Finally, inheritance was also a significant issue. Households were defined by their cross-generational continuity which requires an heir. Although elder care and inheritance requires only one child, preferably male, the labor needs essential for survival were best served by having several viable offspring. Okay, so let me bring this to a close here and talk about and kind of give some clarity about what you're saying, because it's a lot of words. Children were necessary for working the land. Everybody worked the land. Basically, as my friend Kevin Cullen says, ancient Israelites, they were basically like entrepreneurs. They produced their own stuff. They produced their own food. They produced their own clothing. They produced a lot of times their own tools for farming. They would fix it themselves. They did a lot of it. Sometimes there were people who specialized in that and they would go buy from them, but they primarily produced practically everything for themselves. So they needed labor. Where did the labor come from? It was the man, the husband, the wife, the woman, and the children. The children were part of the labor that was needed for them to successfully farm the land and get what they needed in order to survive and thrive. So children were necessary for working the land. They were necessary for survival, to make sure that there was enough to eat. They were necessary to make sure there was enough to wear. And they were necessary to care for their parents. As they got older, they would have to care for their parents in their old age, because there was no Social Security. There were no institutions for elderly care. The children, the family took care of that. So this is the reason, some of the reasons children were so very important. You know, the fifth commandment, honor your mother and father, that doesn't just mean in the ancient world. See, we say, oh, pay respects to your mother and father. That's true. However, in the ancient world, honor your mother and father meant not just to respect them, but also to physically and materially take care of them in their old age, when they can no longer take care of themselves. This is something that Jesus got upset with the Pharisees over. I didn't have this in my notes, but let's read it. Go over to Matthew chapter 15. And we see that this is what this is meant by what Jesus, in rebuking the Pharisees in terms of how, or some of the religious leaders in terms of how they were interpreting the Torah. So in chapter 15, it says in verse 1, then the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. He answered and said to them, now they were talking about transgressing the tradition of the elders, okay, the halakha, the oral tradition of the elders. What do they call it? The oral tradition, the Torah, the Torah Shabbat Peh, the Torah from the mouth, okay? He answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? Now notice, Jesus here is not putting down the Torah. He is critiquing, and he is coming down on their traditions, which cause them to disobey the Torah. For God commanded, saying, honor your father and mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift from God. You can take what you would use to support your parents, and you can say, to spite them, you can say, hey, this is committed to God. So what I was going to use to take care of you, I've committed it to God. I can't take care of you. And he says, you allow them to do this. He said, then he need not honor his father and mother, meaning he need not take care of them. Thus, you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. So here, Jesus is telling us that you are making it out for people to take care of their parents through your traditions. So honor your mother and father was an important tradition, one that Jesus upheld, because elderly parents had no one to take care of them. Children were expected. When you get to a certain age and your parents get to the point where they can't take care of themselves, you are to take care of your parents. This was the idea. So this is another reason, again, why children were so important. So what God told Israel, who were an agrarian people, farmers in ancient Israel, and even in Jesus' day, many of them were farmers. Not all, but many were. He taught them in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 4 through 5, God told Israel that if they walked in covenant faithfulness with him, if they would obey the Torah, quote, blessed shall be the fruit of your bodies, that's children, and notice this, and the produce of your ground, the increase of your herds, the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. This is Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 4 and 5. Notice what comes first in the blessing. The blessing is the fruit of the body. In other words, a promise of children, of many children. This precedes the blessing of the land and household. So before God says, I'm going to bless you with herds, I'm going to bless you the fruit of your ground, I'm going to bless your cattle and the offspring of your flock, I'm going to bless your bread, your basket and your kneading bowl. Before I bless all of that, I'm going to bless you with children. So God is telling them, not only shall you be abundantly blessed in the land, but you're going to be blessed with the family to help take care of the land, to help take care of the blessing, to help manage and preserve the blessing for the next generation, to make sure that the elderly, the father and the mother and other elderly members of the family, that they are taken care of. Who does this? It is the children. So God says, I'm going to bless you with those. I'm going to bless you with what you need to not only secure the blessing of the land, farming the land, sowing, reaping, but also to maintain, to preserve it. This is what the children are for. Many children would help, and many children would provide rest. Remember, it's going to be exhausting toil. So what would many children do? It would provide rest for the mother and the father from all of the exhausting toil. Because when they a lot of times when they would start off, it would be the mother and the father, unless they had help from other family members, but it'd be the mother and father starting off. They're starting their life, and they might live in a compound with other family members, but they have their own land to farm. It's just the two of them. But as they get children, the children would bring rest. How do we know this? There is an indication of this in the book of Genesis. Go there real quick. We're almost done. Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5. Again, we're looking at the cultural context of Genesis 3:16. Genesis chapter 5. What did God say would happen? Because of the sin, there would be worrisome, exhaustive toil, hard work because of the curse upon the land. Genesis chapter 5, verse 28. Lamech lived 182 years, and he had a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, this one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil, the isabone of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. The word Noah in Hebrew is the idea of rest, comfort. So he says, we call his name Noah, rest, comfort, because he will comfort us. He will enable us to have rest concerning our work and the isabone, the physically exhausting toil of our hand. In other words, a child is born. He's 182 years old. Now he has a child to help with the farm work, to help with the production. And he will provide us with rest both now and in the future in our old age, because he's going to be taking care of us. So here we see where a child, Noah, is seen as providing rest to his parents, because he's not going to be there to help them with the work of their hands and to provide for them in their old age. Now, this doesn't mean that children were not loved. It doesn't mean that children were only seen as workers or as tools to alleviate their parents' weariness. This was all seen as part of the blessed life and what was needed to manage and maintain the blessed life. So the land being blessed, the cattle being blessed, the crops being blessed, and having abundant children, all of this, God says, is part of the blessed life. And the children help to manage and maintain the blessed life that God would give them. So this is why some of the reasons why children were seen as such a blessing. Of course, children would carry on the name. Children would also make sure that the inheritance would get passed on, the inheritance of the land, because that was so very important. So when God tells a woman, I will multiply your toils or your work and your conception, God's saying two things, one negative, one positive. Number one, he's saying, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. Here's the bad news first. Because of your sin and Adam's sin, your toil of the land is going to be hard, is going to be exhausting. It'll be physically exhausting and even painful. Here's some good news. In the midst of this toil and pain, I'm also going to bring a blessing. I'm going to multiply unto you many children. They will be a help that will enable you not only to survive, but thrive. They will give you, your children will give you rest from your toil. It was both something negative and positive at the same time. So God was not saying, when he says, I will multiply your sorrow and your conception, he was saying, multiply, I will multiply. Yes, there's going to be a multiplication of the toil because of your sin. It's going to be hard work and going to be exhausting work, but I'm also going to multiply your conceptions, your pregnancies. You will bring forth numerous children. And because you bring forth numerous children, they will give you rest from the toil. Okay? The promise of many children in the midst of painful toil is also a blessing. One of the reasons, because there was a high mortality rate of both women and children in the ancient world. So God is promising them, I'm going to bring your children to birth. Because I think Carol Myers, she says that the mortality rate in the ancient world is like 50%. So if you had, and she actually says you would have to have something like 6 children to get 3, so you'd have enough children to help you to work the land. The mortality rate was high. It's about 50%. So if Israel, they're hearing this, they know this, they're experiencing this, and they hear God saying, but I, God, will multiply your pregnancies. Meaning not only will you be pregnant, because he says, I'm going to bless the fruit of your body. So they are hearing, not only will you get pregnant, you're going to bring your children to term. You will have multiple children. I think we could say, based upon the biblical text, you're not going to lose 50% of your children. God's saying, I'm going to bring your children to full term. You will have multiple children. So if you think about it, women hearing this in these times, when the mortality rate of children is at 50%, hearing that they will have successful multiple pregnancies, it would give them hope. It will give them confidence concerning their future. So even in the midst of this judgment, if Carol Myers and Joy Fleming are correct, and I've looked at what they said, and I think their argument is very convincing, that what God here is saying, in the midst of this judgment, he's also giving them a promise. He's giving them a future. He's giving them a hope. Yes, there will be painful toil, but I will give you the blessing of multiple children, multiple pregnancies, conceptions. So you will have a lot of children and these children will work with you, and they will ultimately bring you toil from the physical exhaustion of working the land. This is what God is saying to Eve. It is a judgment, but even in the judgment, there is a blessing. Now, how does this tie in to the rest of it? And we're going to cover this next week when it says, in pain, you shall bring forth children, which is the birth. We're going to talk about this next week and get more into what it means and how this all ties together, and why it is so important that we read this and we understand this in its cultural context. But what I want you to walk away with is that God was not saying to Eve, based upon the work of Carol Myers and Joy Fleming, he was not saying, Eve, part of your punishment, I'm going to make it really hurt when you have children. That's not what he said. I'm going to increase your pain. He was saying, yes, there will be an increase of toil. This we see in the world, toiling to get things done. We see the anxiety. This we see, right? We don't see all women being nymphomaniacs. We don't see all women being slavish or slavish toward their husbands. We don't see all women being resistant and antagonistic to their husbands and trying to overcome them. But what we do see is a lot of work, a lot of women in different cultures working hard and bringing forth children. God said the bringing forth of the children is to result in rest when we look at it within the context of the culture of the day. Does that make sense? I hope you got something out of this, that in this, there was the judgment, but there was also a blessing. And actually, you will see this, that there is something good, there's something bad, but there's something good. There's something good, there's something bad. Well, let me be like this. There's something bad, but then there's something good. When we get to Adam, there's something bad, but there's also something good. Even when God talks to the serpent, there's going to be something bad, the judgment, but then also there's going to be something good. We see this consistently. We see this as a pattern within the Genesis 3 text. All right. I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope this made sense. Keep staying with us. We're going to talk about this some more next week, a part 2 to this, as we get more into the next part of Genesis 3:16. And we're going to bring it all together and hope that it makes sense of what is it that God is saying to us. When we understand what was said, we can better understand what he is saying. So God bless you. All right. If you enjoyed this and you want to see this again, I'm going to upload it to our YouTube channel, KIC TV. If you were blessed by this, you're like, wow, I never knew this before. This is great insight. and you think it'll benefit someone else, please share this with other people that you know will benefit from it. And Lord willing, we will see you all next week. All right. So this should be uploaded the next 24 hours, direct someone to KIC TV. Be blessed until we see you again next week. Bye-bye.